So, hello, everyone out there, and thank you for coming to this chat with Yong Shu Hoong. We're going to be talking about my work, The Gaze. Shu and I met many years ago. I think it was 2005 in Austin, Texas. There was a reading. I think it was called a porch reading, and it was hosted by a great friend of mine called Stasia McFadden. Yeah. It was a place called Heritage House, I think.
Oh, you got good memory.
I remember particularly two people from that reading. Valerie Bridgman Davis, I think her name is, wonderful woman, great energy, fantastic poems, and Yong Shu Hoong, yourself. I remember hearing the title of a poem, which I'm going to ask you to read so people use that as an introduction to you. The Heroics of Loneliness. And immediately I thought, oh my gosh, what a fantastic title. So by way of introduction, before you take over and we talk about The Gaze, could you please read The Heroics of Loneliness?
Thank you. With pleasure, Nii. Well, it's been quite a while since I've written this poem.
That book was out in 97,
yeah,
right?
This book was 97, yeah. And your first chapbook was out in 99.
99, yeah. So a couple of years after.
Okay, so it's called Heroics of Loneliness. Really, what can one expect in a Chinese restaurant in a city considered by one of my friends to be the least Asian of all American cities? But there I was, asking the waitress about cab fares and directions when he overheard me from the next table. He invited himself over and started asking questions. Cautiously, trying not to sound intrusive, he offered to take me to see the remaining sights of the city before my train at midnight, if I wanted. For a moment, I could only think of rape and dismemberment. After all, he did look like a version of Dennis Hopper, beneath the meekness, a subliminal trace of menace. Eventually, I said okay against my judgment, and the next thing I knew, we were riding the rail to his home 3 stations away. Jury duty today, he told me, didn't bother to drive. He pointed out his car, parked alongside the road, as we approached the house that his parents had left him. In the sitting room, there was a decorated tree, which he had never bothered to take down from past Christmases. As we sat trading pieces of autobiography, he told me he never married, tried adopting a kid from Korea, but later found out that she was retarded. A pity. So now America wouldn't take her. He talked about the last time he met her, how she could almost utter, "Dad?" When it was time to go for a ride, he decided to let the engine stir for a while before we headed for the night. Driving around like old acquaintances, we gazed at old houses along Mexican Wall Streets, passing the pubs in Shadyside, and then the Civic Arena. We even stopped for drinks at the Rosebud, a place swamped by loud alternative rock, which I think I appreciated more than him. And after the alcohol, I had no more excuses for not acknowledging him as friend. When the time came for parting, we shook each other's hand long and hard, not without a tinge of something, and in what more appropriate setting than the train station. Of course, we promised to keep in touch, etc. I never forgot his kindness. It was only later that I realized we never quite broached the subject of loneliness. Thank you.
I'm always going to love that poem. Always.
Do you remember which city that is set in?
Do you know, we talked about it, but I don't remember.
Yeah, I used to do it like a game, like anybody who could name the city get a free book or something. It's Pittsburgh.
That's it. That's it. And actually, the clue in there is the rails, right? Because
well, actually, you can't really tell.
yeah, but Pittsburgh has a lot of rails.
Yeah, it does.
It has a whole lot of rails. So
and it's got a lot of bridges as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I remember speaking about this poem at length with you, yeah, it's just great to hear it again after all those years, 15 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Actually, I thought that we might have met in 2003 instead of 2005, though.
I think we read together in 2005. We may have met in 2003.
Did you go every year?
I didn't go every year.
I
didn't go every year. But I think I went in 2003. If we met in 2003, it would have been through Agnes, maybe.
Could be.
Yeah.
Well, Agnes goes like every year during that time, right?
Well, she used to, yeah.
Every year, yeah. So,
anyway,
do you think about those days? You know, back in Austin, and have you been back there recently?
I haven't been to Austin since, I would say, 2007, maybe.
Wow, that was a long time ago. Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess, you know, places change. I mean, I think Austin will be unrecognizable to me now.
You think so? Some ways. It might still be the same. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think centrally it's probably a little gentrified. And then, I mean, I think politically, sociopolitically, America is, I find some cities, when I go back to them, I don't recognize them. Yeah. So, but I'd love to go. I mean, I love the food portions.
Well, the barbecues?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know, Nii, could you maybe just share with us a little bit of your impressions of America, especially Texas? Like, did you find it was a strange place?
Do you know, it was familiar and strange at the same time. Familiar because there's a kind of warmth, you know, that people have, which, you know, I mean, given that I'd gone there from England, which is quite reserved, it was a real welcome thing that people were so warm. And also that food portions were actually food portions rather than decorative portions, which is the mode in Europe.
Right.
But I did find that, you know, as much as people were kind-hearted, there wasn't any desire to move or to know the world beyond, well, I mean, and this is a generalization, because there were lots of people who had moved around quite a lot. And you have to remember that Austin's on the Chitlin circuit. So it's one of the places that used to have Black American musicians, you know, play in the time when there was segregation and stuff like that. So it's one of the more enlightened American towns.
Right.
But for anything that's happening like a festival, people drift in from the outskirts. And so I met people who were wonderful, but they just, I mean, there's one guy I spent maybe 4 hours talking to, because when he met me and I was speaking English, he didn't believe I wasn't American, right? So he said, why do I have a funny accent? And I said, well, actually, I came from England. And he said, y'all have Black people in England? And I said, yes. And then his next thing, which is why we ended up talking for three hours, because I had to give him a history of geography and colonialism and everything. His next thing he said was, well, y'all must have Mexicans too. So like his conception of the world was, we are the center. The people who kind of encroach are Black people and Mexicans. So if you have one, you must have the other.
Right.
And so I said, yes, there are Mexicans, but it's not what you think. And I said, you do realize that Texas was part of Mexico, which was mind blowing for him. And then we started this whole thing. So in the end, you know, we became friends. When I went back in 2007, he came specifically to see me, you know, that kind of thing.
So it was the idea of you're either kind of like America, or maybe you are totally different from America. And then that's where the context, right? The reference, the point of reference is.
Yeah. And
well,
yes. So it's.
You remember this?
I do remember that. How could I forget?
I still have this copy.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're one of the. Yeah, I haven't seen a copy of that. Well, I've seen a copy,
Is
but I
it
haven't seen a
is it
copy
out
of it.
of print?
It is out of print.
Right.
It's on Kindle, but it's out of print. Even
And that
though
was the book that you were reading from, I think, when we
it
met.
was the book I was reading from the
Yeah.
first time, certainly, yeah. It might come back into print. There's a couple of publishers talking to me about it, but yeah.
So I think it's a good time.
Came back into
Isaac.
print, right?
Well, it was reprinted, I think, a couple of times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought this might be a good way to kind of move to your new book.
Wonderful, thank you.
How do I pronounce the title though? Is that Gaze?
The Gaze.
Or
The Gaze.
Gaze?
Yeah.
Just Gaze?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the book?
So, I mean, it's a book that's in 4 sections. And the 4 sections, the titles of the sections mirror the letters in the title. But it's all about what you see and what you don't see, right?
Right.
That's why the title is also pronounced The Gaze, even though when you see it, it says it looks like the G's. So there's lots of play to do with what you see and what you don't, that kind of thing. But it's really an exploration of transition. So the first section is play, game, is to do with playing with poetic form, but also talking about sports. Then there's an era section, talks about love and lust. Then there's which sounds like which is about gossip and the way that water goes everywhere. And then there's Z is zest, and that's to do with contemporary culture. So what's popping, is zesty.
Cool.
And so those are, the sections. But I think what the poems share are an exploration of what lies beneath.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I read somewhere that mentioned the phrase midlife crisis.
Yes.
Like, is this book actually something that comes out of a midlife crisis?
It's a book that explores the notion of midlife crisis without, because it's not something I've ever really believed in. I think it's too much of a generalization. I've seen people come into their own after they're 50. So what would be their midlife? Yeah. So it's that thing of exploring, I suppose, also the way the world looks at people of a certain age. And if you behave a certain way, people will argue with you and say you're not that age.
Right.
That kind of thing. And so, yeah. So it is, yeah. I mean, midlife is the point at which people are, I suppose, deciding if they confine you to the realm of the elders or the people you can still hang out with. So there is that.
Right. What are the symptoms though? I mean, do you tend to look at the past a lot?
I think you have more past to look at. And you have more distance from certain points in the past where you can begin to make sense of them. Because I think a lot of life is making sense of things as you go along. Right. And the further you go away from something, the more senses you can make of it. You make one kind of sense of something when you go past it. Right. And then further down the line, you start to see other perspectives. And I think one of the things that time gives you is the ability to see more perspectives. Sure. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that I felt when I was writing this book, compared to maybe when I was writing Eyes of a Boy, Lips of a Man, when I was I think I was 20 in my early 20s. The book was published when I was 25, but I was in my early 20s, late teens when I was writing it, the poems in it. So for instance, my father's death is something I revisit in this book, but I've written about in Eyes of a Boy, Lips of a Man. And I look at the two and I can see they're both valid explorations. But I now have the perspective of a father as well, right? And so then I put my grief in the context of what exactly did you expect to happen? Did you want to go before him? How do you think that would have made him feel? Right?
Right.
So it's this strange transition that happens, which I wouldn't call a midlife crisis. I would just call a process of learning, which I believe all life is. if you leave yourself open to it.
There was a rather tender poem called Seeing Eyes, which I thought might be something that you would want to read, because it seems to link the present to the past, right?
Yes.
So maybe we could talk about it after you have read it.
Wonderful. I'd love to read it.
Yeah.
Seeing Eyes. Pretending I can't find my Bio Bibio simply because she has covered her eyes gives her as much joy as the silly faces I sometimes pull. Out of the 43 facial muscles I should have, I stretch, contract, contort, conjure shapes that get the desired reaction. But when she hides, she is in control, even ridicules me for not seeing her. I'm right here, Daddy, she screams, then runs to hug me. Already the time is coming when the trick will be too old. I know so well how soon our pleasures go. I recall hiding from my grandma, her dark eyes imprisoned behind cataracts. I was always stunned how easily she found me. She didn't even move. She just pointed. And my reaction was always, how? Some quality of those hours with her is how I see God. Something of her certainty that I had my late father's physiognomy just from the sound of my voice. How she hugged this inherited body, this borrowed shape and hue close to her, cradled its shifting face, seeing and loving a grandchild with no eyes.
Cool. That's great.
That's my grandmother was blind from the moment I knew her. And so she was always a wonder to us. She was very independent. She lived alone.
Yeah.
And when you visited, you go in the kitchen and cook up something amazing and bring it out. And as kids, it was just a little mind-blowing. So
was this in England or was this in Ghana?
This was in Ghana.
Okay. But you were born in London, right?
But my parents were studying
England, okay.
And
right.
We went to Ghana after they finished studying. So I grew up in Ghana, very much so.
Okay.
It was a great joy, running wild, and so this was in Ghana.
And how many children do you have now?
I have 3 kids, 2 girls.
And this is about my last daughter that you mentioned, your youngest daughter.
BOBBO means my littlest daughter in Ghana.
Okay.
Yes.
So, that's cool, because when you write about your daughter, being a father, do you always think about your own father and things like that?
I think that when I'm writing about my children, it's almost inevitable that I think about my parents, because there's a kind of reflective element to it. Because when you're writing, you're also paying attention in ways that you don't when you're just running around and getting things done and picking them up and carrying them on your neck. You're just doing those things. But when you sit back to reflect, which I have a lot of time to do because I'm away from them quite a bit, because I'm not with their mother anymore. And so they're only with me on weekends. So I literally have the whole week to think about them.
Right.
I've had this training, I'd like to say, in missing them, but also the joy of being able to reflect on the moments that we spend together. But in doing that, I think about myself, because I see similarities in their behavior and mine, and I see the things that maybe sometimes it's my duty as a parent to chastise them for, but half the time I'm holding back a laugh because I remember doing exactly the same thing and feeling like I shouldn't have been told off. So
right.
I am now telling them off for doing something that I didn't want to be told off for. So those moments carry, I suppose, the nostalgia of, and also the gratitude and insight of seeing things from my parents' perspective. And so the two come together quite effortlessly. Yeah.
I think for me, this process of getting old is also coming to terms with this notion of nostalgia, I suppose. I mean, like
Yeah.
you said, there's a lot more of the past
Yes.
to look back on, and there's a lot more of the past to feel nostalgic about.
Yes.
In that sense, right?
Yeah.
Well, in the same section of the book, this first section called Game, there's also this poem called A Gimbal of Blackness. Do I
Yes.
pronounce it correctly? Is it called a gimbal?
Yes, a gimbal.
Yeah. And that's a poetic form that you have invented, right?
Yes.
So I don't know whether you could maybe just explain this form a little bit. And then
actually,
maybe,
it's a good thing that you're asking now, because Kai, who's watching as well, asked a question about that. The gimbal is a form that came out of experimentation in wanting to kind of explore. So this is not the first gimbal I wrote. The first gimbal I wrote is a poem in here called Of Serendipity. Its first title was Gyroscope 1. And I was trying to write about my grief, my enduring grief at the loss of my father, because one of the things that has become evident over a quarter of a century since he died is that grief doesn't really go away. You carry it with you. So it's about how you carry it with you. And so in trying to write about it and for it to kind of have the quality of learning and insight, and at the same time an emotional ballast, so to speak, I just was playing around with how to express myself. And what eventually came out in the gimbal is a form which is 5 lines, then a single line, and 4 lines, and a single line, 4 lines, a single line, and 5 lines, which for me, when it evolved, was a way of allowing me to breathe. In the way that when you express something emotional, you gush and then you pause. And then, there'll be a moment of realization and you say that. And then when that happens, you then gush again. And so that, for me, is what influenced the form of the gimbal. And its name came out of the fact that the first poem I was writing was called Gyroscope 1. Now, gyroscopes have these gimbals, which are if you've seen one, it's got these stabilizing hoops. It's got a central hoop and then 2 stabilizing hoops, and so that's how it keeps moving. And the form effectively took that, because the single lines are like the gimbals of a gyroscope, and they anchor the poem. And there's a transition which was necessary for me in order to do this, from the logical and the rational into the emotional. So the turn that happened on the central line, which is sort of the turn of the poem, where the poem gets its final realization and it goes into, okay, yes, this is it. I'm going to face this emotion, and then it becomes more emotional. So that's.
I think you should read the poem.
Yes,
just as the demonstration.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, A Gimbal of Blackness for Pops. Night cannot grasp the swift flight of wind, but blackens every tree the air moves, paints them darker, pushes them against the light, the shapeless light that gives them shape to shift before my eyes. I am often in the embrace of night. I am myself a dark thing, the kind that was once called boy when man, that was born of a woman descended from hills, and a man delivered from boyhood by the sea. A man now lifeless, though he gave me life. I am often in the embrace of dark thoughts, in the dim grasp of memory, a bottle in hand, reflecting the light of the moon. I recall a can of Guinness left in a London fridge, one my father bought but didn't get to drink, kept for me by a well-meaning aunt. And how hard my throat shrank with every sip, how sharp that smooth black liquid felt inside me, how hard these nights that blacken me, broken with grief for a man I loved who can no longer grieve.
So this is for your father as well, right?
Yes. Yes.
And this is like do you see this like one of the many sequels that you have written after that first poem called Father, which is in your first chapbook?
Yes, certainly. I mean,
Right.
that first poem was written, that poem came to me as a shock. I was at a party dancing. It was one of these house parties when I was in university, and I just suddenly stopped. I left the woman I was dancing with, and I went to sit on the stairs in the house and started crying. And I wrote this poem. I wrote that poem, I should say.
Right.
And it was the first time I was able to write about it. And it must have been, I would say, maybe 2 years after my father died, 3 years after my father died. So, time had passed. And yeah, so it was the first time that I could actually face the emotion and write it. And then since then, there have been many poems that broach the subject. But yeah.
So was his passing quite sudden, or was that something kind of expected? Or
it was sudden. It was sudden. He had cancer. He was supposed to be in remission, but there had been some error. So there was a sudden kind of, in the way that cancer comes back with a vengeance, it just came. And I think for me, one of the things that has made it a haunting thing is that I wasn't there when he died. He was in Ghana. I was in England. I was supposed to start university. I had deferred university because I visited the hospital with him, etc. And then, they said, yeah, you're fine. And so he went back to Ghana. And so there was no monitoring for a while. And then suddenly he seemed to be, and at that time I was in England. My mother, to make me not worry, did not tell me how serious things were. And it went very quickly. And, I heard later he'd been asking for me. And so it haunts me. And I think, so for that reason, I think it's something that I'm going to continue to explore. Yeah, I'm sure I'll continue to explore. So, yeah.
But I also noticed that the word black comes up quite a bit throughout the book, right? So when you talk about black or blackness, is that a sense of pride being part of the African diaspora or something?
So one of the things that I've been doing recently in my work is the thing about the English language is that within it, black has so many negative connotations. So I'm writing it to reclaim it or to reshape its connotations in English. It's not so much a thing of black pride, because I also feel like there's a kind of twisted logic to that, as though you need to be reminded to be proud, or you have to. I've never not been proud of who I am, so having to kind of shout it out is a kind of it's counterintuitive. And so all I'm doing is doing my work as a writer. Hold on one second. I'm going to pin something on on Instagram so people can see the link for the YouTube. Sure. Yeah, so I call it black positive. So I'm just using the word and using it in ways that are not about, yeah. Or
well, your next section is called Eros.
Yes.
And I can't remember whether the word black has also made some appearances there.
Yeah, I'm sure. The thing I probably won't remember off the top of my head, but I'm sure it's there. Certainly darkness. So I use them interchangeably. So there's definitely darkness. So there's blackness, there's darkness. And they both feature quite prominently.
Well, because you've asked me to pick some poems for you to read, one of the poems from the Eros section is this one called Blowing Smoke, which I thought might be something good for you to read, and then we can talk a bit more about it.
Okay, certainly. Thank you. Blowing Smoke. For the curve of dismounts. She lifts her head to gift the stars white smoke, and my lips are drawn to the floral arch of her neck, inching higher, the swirl her fragrant exhalations make becoming night. Breath to air, dust to dust. We are mortals drenched in a hummingbird sensation of time. I have known moments like this. My naked torso brown as the bark of the mango tree I've mounted, its leaves camouflage while I watch my playmates seeking me. Excitement choking me the same way her moving fingers make my breath hover. She catches me in the corner of her eye. My lips tremble on her skin before the giggle becomes sound. Lightning to thunder. Sometimes I was found. Some girl or boy throwing stones, breaking the amnios of leaves that protected me. But most times, I just got tired of waiting and shimmied down. Love is a little like that. The playmates plentiful as pollen grains, yet only a few bursting beyond the red bubble of lust. To the heart, the after giggle, where the smoke rings go.
Mm. It's amazing how you can come up with a poem about love when the usual, idea about love poems or even worse, erotic poems, is that it's really difficult to write a love or erotic poem well. So what sort of tips would you give like to an aspiring writer who wants to write love poems, I mean, I myself find it quite difficult to talk about love and, and the eros.
I think, the thing that I hold on to is that love is part of life. And I think we're very often raised to compartmentalize love and lust as a separate thing. But actually, all the elements that go into love and lust are pretty much, the same as we have in everyday life. It's just maybe the placement and juxtaposition of bodies and limbs slightly different. but it is part of everyday life. And so by not putting it on a kind of pedestal, it's easier to just experience it for what it is and to express it for what it is. I think that for me is the thing. And so I like to use quite mundane similes when I'm writing about these things, because in those mundane things, there's a kind of revelation that can happen in both ways. Because it's mundane, people can identify it, but also the mundane can take on an erotic or erotic, for want of a better word, sheen. And I just think I think that's beautiful. It's one of the gifts that we have in life, that everything can be that beautiful if we let it.
I don't know whether most of the similes or the imagery that you're trying to conjure are based on mundane things. Like I thought, like you mentioned, brown as the bark of the mango tree. I thought that's highly eroticized. You don't think so?
Well, I mean, but the bark of a mango tree again is a mundane thing as well. I mean, if you grew up where I grew up, I mean, in Europe, it's an exotic thing. But where I grew up, we climbed mango trees all the time. So we were intimate with mango trees. So because I was intimate with mango trees, it's easy for me to then bring a mango tree into an intimate poem, right? So yes, it's mundane, but yes, I do also have quite a close relationship with that particular kind of bark.
But I mean, when we're talking about the color black, here you seem to have taken a pause from black and going into different colors, right? I think there's a mention of brown, there's white, there's also red towards the end, right?
Yeah.
So that's what love makes you think about in terms of different colors, or.
I mean, I think it's just about bookmarking moments, and I think all intense experiences in life can distill down to just how well defined the outline of a leaf is in that moment, or something like that. And so sometimes it's in colors, sometimes it's in texture.
Right.
I mean, I think I find when I read my work back, there's lots of texture in it as well. And I think that's just how, these experiences live within me. I experience them as very visually in a very tactile manner as well. And in this particular poem, I was really, I remember the moment so much because of the smoke rings. And so if you see the poem on the page, instead of using 1, 2, and 3, I use a single smoke ring, a double smoke ring, and a triple smoke ring. Because again, what I try to do in poetry is just to bring the simplicity or of the everyday life onto the page. As much as it's a poem, it's also a conversation. It's also just it's like me talking to somebody right next to me. And
Well, speaking of texture, I know you tried to explain the title of the next section, and the next section is spelled EAUX. Is that French or?
That's French for waters.
For water, right? Or liquid. Yeah. But you said it's also about gossip, is it?
Yes. So
why is that so? Yeah.
Well, I mean, so it's the way that water goes everywhere. So water, if you think about it, water is the biggest gossip in the world. It goes from one shore and it goes all the way across the world through rivers, through rain, everywhere. It just goes everywhere. And so that's why it's that. And also I use the French word because it sounds like oh, which is the sound, people make when they hear some news that they weren't expecting, etc. So they play on that as well. Yeah.
So why is this particular poem? Well, I picked this poem Defenses because it mentions Singapore, right?
Yes.
Right. So I don't know, is this something that you did after your trip in 2018 when you visited Singapore, and then
yes,
I wrote part of it was
I think I wrote this after after I visited Malaysia. Yeah. I think I wrote this after I visited Malaysia. So
how does this fit into this particular section though?
Yes. Well, because it's talking about an uncle. There are all of these stories that just come into it. And so it's in the way of gossip, how you start on one thing and then you end on the other, on something else. And that's how it fits in there. So yes, there are elements of love. There's an element of play with structure, but the section that most embraces it in terms of the way that it flows is O. And also, there's a lot of water in this poem.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you like me to read it?
Is it too long for you to read because it's a poem in 3 parts?
Yeah, it is. I mean, so yeah, we'll see. I mean, I can read maybe the second section, which is a lot of the kind of the gossip element of it, which then fits in the section.
Cool. Yeah.
2. So the poem's called Defensive. This is part 2. When my Uncle Freddie dies, you hold my hand in a damp grip, which reminds me of our first sweat-heavy coupling in Accra under a fan. While I tell you stories my father told me about Freddie's incredible prowess at sport, how he later escaped a kidnap plot by a corrupt government by hiding in the boot of a Welsh lecturer's car as she drove to Abidjan for a weekend tryst. But we are both stunned at his funeral as 3 previously unknown children of his emerge from beneath the high pitch of the voice reading his obituary, their eyes damp with love that belies distance. They will later reveal that one weekend a month, he collected each of them from their mothers, took them to a quiet beach house with a view of the stars. He fed them breakfast of fresh fish, grilled on the shore, taught them sprinting and salsa, talked about physics and politics. Strange but wonderful father, they say, after you have wiped my tears with your pinky. So you see,
once again, yeah, it's very tender as well. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of and it connecting generations and just things that have been overheard that then go into yeah.
So you wrote this poem while you were in Malaysia, and that was a trip that you did right after Singapore, is it?
No, no, no.
Oh.
No, I visited Malaysia before Singapore. As with a lot of these things, some of it is autobiographical, some of it's not. And sometimes when it is autobiographical, I might change details. So Singapore is sitting in there for Malaysia.
Ah, okay. Well, the Malaysians wouldn't like this. You know?
Well, yes,
Okay.
but let's, yeah. And so yeah, I think that's what happened there.
But speaking about Singapore and Malaysia and all that, I mean, do you miss traveling?
I really miss traveling.
Yeah,
I love traveling.
do you used to like travel back and forth the UK and Ghana and going overseas for festivals and things like that?
Yes, I mean, I think travel has always been part of my life. I mean, even within Ghana. So I did my national service in the north of Ghana. It was a wonderful year. And when we were younger, my father used to travel up and down the country. He was a troubleshooter, industrial troubleshooter. So when there were problems at factories in what we call the hinterlands, he would drive over to go and, you know, sort these things out. And if we were on holiday, he would take us with him on trek. And so we'd go in the car, we'd be in the back of the car and with some snacks, singing as we drove across the country. He'd drop us in a village somewhere in the care of some trusted people, and he'd go and do his work and come back and we'd go. So there was always movement. I mean, even from birth, right? Because I moved from England to Ghana. And that there's an enduring memory of that in the amount of light that there was in Ghana when I arrived, which I had never experienced before, because England's light is almost like it's hiding it under, you know, something. And I got to Ghana and suddenly, oh my gosh, there's so much light in the world. And so all of those things, the perspective that comes from distance, all of that may actually have some part in maybe my formation as a writer, just having things to compare and, you know, yeah.
So before COVID places all this restriction on travel, how did you divide your time between Ghana and England?
Well, I mean, so I have 3 kids, and that's three birthdays. So essentially, that was the minimum factor. I would be in England for my children's birthdays, and I wouldn't stay for just a couple of days. I would tend to stay for 2 to 3 weeks. So that's the minimum. But then also for work. So if somebody asked me to come and run some workshops or do a residency, and then I would go as well. And so sometimes I would get stuff in France or in Germany or in Switzerland, and I would use England as a base and go and do that work. And yeah.
But otherwise you would be based in Ghana, right?
Yes, it's where I am most at ease, and I'm most productive.
Cool.
Yeah.
How much time do we have got left?
We have, I'd say, about 5 minutes.
Wow. Okay. I really wanted to cover all the 4 sections, though.
Yes.
Should we do a music-related one?
Absolutely. Why not?
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't believe this. Like just this morning, you know, like how Facebook would sometimes recommend you products that you don't need. Do you know that there's actually a Korean perfume for men that's called Friday Night Moonwalk?
I had no idea.
Well, we are doing a Saturday night, at least Singapore's time.
Yes.
We are doing a Saturday night moonwalk. So there is a poem that's called Moonwalk.
Yes.
Which I think most people would be able to guess that it's somehow related to Michael Jackson.
Yes.
So how about if you could read it and then we could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, certainly. Moonwalk. Once you nail it, you're hooked as a baby that's discovered rhythm. Round a bright corner and back, in the middle of a mate's party, the crowd parting as if you have dark ones for legs. Skill becoming reflex. It won't hit you until after your 5th heartbreak. The probability that you're lost to go back to the lover before the last might be linked to that rapid flick of Michael Joseph's glove before he floats backwards. After all, whatever problems you might have had with the old flames, there's been reflection. Funny how you forget the petty flashpoints of your rows, but can recall exactly how they made your skin tingle. The imprint of their lips at the tips of your fingers, still a phantom that can resurrect shivers. What's important is that for now, it's just an urge. You know, cause and effect is never simple. You know, MJJ learned that move from someone. You've heard his father beat him. You know, your own daddy used to slap your mommy. She'd lift you by your arms, leave, but always returned. The music his pleading made was an addiction she couldn't shake till he died. And that whole vial of time you hid in your room, rewinding that Maxell, stopping the tape at the point in Billie Jean when that bass rhythm hits, then pressing play, the song's protest surging forth while you learn to glide back, 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 pause, shimmy, the volume rising of arguments, your heels repelling each other like magnets, never touching earth.
Wow, that's great. So how do you like infuse the sense of music and your memories of music into your poems?
I mean, I think there was music all around me all the time. And I often say that my creative heroes very often are actually musicians rather than writers necessarily. And so I think the music seeps in. And I think when you're surrounded by something, then your language becomes infused with it. In the same way that when you go to a country and you know its indigenous language, you realize how many of the similes come from the landscape around. And I think music is part of my landscape. And so my vocabulary and all the languages I speak also include music. In this particular poem, I was writing about a friend who had a very interesting upbringing. Parents fighting all the time. I mean, it's one of those things that they sing about in the songs and say it's crazy love, right? And then we have a common love of Michael Jackson's music. We used to dance and try to dance, copy his dance moves together and stuff like that. I wanted to write about my friend without mentioning my friend. So I took from Michael Jackson's life, knowing that his father, used to beat him, and probably, the entire Jackson crew.
Right.
And just found the simile, but also I mined from my own experience of this nostalgia that you have for exes, of going back, because it's easy to judge somebody who keeps going back to a lover that abuses them. But actually, when we think about it, there are moments when we've left a lover, in a low moment, you just might think, oh, I just wish they were here. As much as you may have left for them behaving in the most despicable fashion, you still think about it. You have that moment. And so it just takes a little step to go from that to actually going back, right? So, so those are the things I was exploring in there. And so the music becomes a way of me talking about this without mentioning my friend, who would not appreciate it if I, spoke about, as much as that, because his life affected me in the sense that when things were fractious at home, he would run to my home. So,
So on the surface, I mean, this poem looks like it fits right into this section that's called Zest.
Yes.
Because of, Michael Jackson's, the kind of music that you can imagine when you listen to this poem.
Yeah.
But there's also something that's a lot more serious and dark that goes behind it, I guess. Yeah. So I think that's interesting because, like, in terms of music and all that, do you still listen to a lot of music these days?
Yeah, I do. I do. Yeah.
And I know that I've picked this one that's on like contemporary pop music, but you've also written a lot of poems about blues and jazz and things like that, right?
Yeah.
And I think some of those poems are in this particular section as well. Right.
Yeah. So I mean, the blues and the jazz is, it's a heritage that came to me initially reluctantly because my father used to play blues and jazz, and we all used to say, "What's this old man music?" You know,
Right.
and then at some point, you know, it kind of seeped into the consciousness, and I began to love it. My father made me a tape when I was leaving home, and it became the vehicle. It was a Jimmy Smith tape. It became the vehicle into jazz for me. The
Right.
blues, it's really odd because the blues I never actually didn't like. I mean, the jazz was, because the blues had lyrics, right? And I've always loved
Right.
words. And a lot of the jazz was instruments. And I as much as I love music, I didn't really understand music that much. So it's just like, and my father would say, no, you can hear, because he could hear, like, if you had 7 different versions of Giant Steps by John Coltrane, he would tell you each one. And he would say, no, you have to listen to each instrument separately. I'm like, it's just a mess of instruments. What are you talking about? You know? And so, you know, my life since has been this lesson of learning how to listen. And I find a lot of parallels in my own life, in my reading, just the way I experience the world, in listening for the different instruments. I think Kai had another question that I needed to answer. There was one that was embedded in your question. I think you asked a question about language, about whether I use, the choice of language I use in the poem is based on where the poem is set. But actually, I think it's based on the subject. If the subject requires it, the language will shift. So in something to do with my older brother, who I share, I suppose, the most languages with, there might be quite a lot of shift in language because that's how we communicate. We go to the language that gives us the quickest way to express the thought. And so the poems might reflect that. Whereas if I'm writing something that happened in the streets of Accra, you know, then Pidgin, you know, might figure, if the person I was dealing with was somebody who spoke a lot of Pidgin. If they spoke standard English, or they were trying to take me to court, it would be a very standard English. So yeah, I think it's the subject rather than the place. I look at languages, and I'm sure, you know, it's similar for you in Singapore. I look at languages as a blessing we have. Those of us who have more than one, that allows us to jump, to make the best abstraction, because actually all language is abstraction. We are using abstraction to express abstraction. And so having more languages just means that you can fine tune your abstraction a little bit more to try and take somebody to how you actually feel. And that is the constant quest of poetry for me. It is trying to reach that perfect expression of an idea. And it's also why I wanted to have these discussions with poets, and poets that are not necessarily based in the West, because I think a lot of our discussions of literature are often skewed by how the West spotlights them. You know, they'll spotlight a particular thing, and then it becomes about, oh, isn't it quaint how he uses this word? Or, you know, but actually it's a lot more than that, you know. So yeah. So again, thank you so much for you know, agreeing to kind of have this conversation.
I mean, it's really my honor to, and I think language and music is probably a good point to slowly lead towards the end of the conversation, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah. So how can we buy copies of your books, especially for some people might be tuning in from Singapore?
I don't know how to answer the Singapore question, except to say that I will ask my publisher. But I mean, I think in general, you know, what I've noticed that is that in Singapore, you find ways of getting books from England. So the book is available on most, you know, retail platforms. You know, your Waterstones, your Foils, your Amazon, etc. And so it should be available through those means. But I also believe that the publisher has a distributor that handles that region to some degree. So I would double check and put some information out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, all the best for your book. You're going to have another conversation, or is this the last one?
I'm going to have another conversation with the writer Kosumana Roy from India. We haven't set the date yet, but we'll be having that, and then we will have a final conversation with two. I think now that just came to me this morning with two writers at the same time, but based in England.
Wow. Okay, cool.
It will probably be online like this. It would have been nice to have it in person, but the way things are going with our government's handling of COVID, I think we will have to keep using these electronic means.
Well, look on the bright side. I mean, if not for COVID, this conversation across oceans might not take place.
Oh, yeah, I think
for whatever reason, even if you would invite me to fly over, I might not be able to, or whatever. It might just be difficult that way.
Yeah.
But in this sense, you've got more flexibility to really meet up with anyone around the world.
I do. And it certainly made me think about it just made me think about who do I want to have the conversation with rather than who is here.
Right. Precisely.
And so certainly in that way it helped, because I think we could have had the conversation in those times anyway, but would I have thought about it? I would have probably thought about somebody who is already in the UK. So it's been really good in that sense. I'm actually saying COVID's good. Oh my gosh, what's happening?
Well, we have to look on the bright side.
Yes,
I mean, that's the only way we could, continue living and
on the sunny side of the street. Yes. So thank you again.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks to everyone who's watching live on YouTube. Those of you who've gone to Instagram and then found your way to YouTube. And the mini family that we have with us on Zoom, who are essentially my technical team and support system. And see you at the next conversation. Again, thank you very much, Yong Shu Hoong. People, make sure you follow him. Make sure you buy the book, The Gaze, which is out now. Sorry, I'll take this away so you can see the cover. And until the next time, thank you.
Cool, bye.
Bye.